let's move on. Let's talk to Tab. Good morning, Tab.
Good morning.
Hello, the Managing Director of Employ. Tell us about that. It's an employability organisation. Tell us about what it is that you do.
So, EmployAbility is a not-for-profit organisation which we set up about 8 years ago. And the aim of EmployAbility is to work with disabled students and graduates to support and advise them in the transition from education to employment.
Yes.
And then we work with employers looking to become more disability inclusive. One thing I'd just like to say very quickly before I move on, though, in response to Lily, I've just been listening to her very tragic story about her son, is that there is a scheme called Access to Work that is not particularly well publicised, a government scheme that actually pays for up to 100% of adjustment costs for disabled people who need adjustments in the workplace. So whilst it's the employer's duty and the onus is on the employer to make the adjustment, this particular scheme is attached to the individual, and the individual, with the support of their employer, can apply for this and get up to 100% adjustment cost met, which means it's a very expensive adjustments like the ones she mentioned could potentially be paid for by this scheme, and thereby allowing her son to perhaps work at this organisation which otherwise couldn't afford those adjustments.
Thank you. Thank you for that. We will call her back and give her those details.
Thank you, that's really kind. Tab, can you tell me, how much has the workplace environment and opportunities changed for disabled workers?
I think it's changing. I think it's a very slow change. When I first started working in this area some 14 years ago, really disability was nowhere on anybody's agenda. It was the poor cousin of other diversity strands. But increasingly we're finding that there are more and more organisations becoming aware that it is a strand they have to take seriously. It is something they have to look at within their own organisations. And, you know, perhaps particularly with an ageing population, ageing workforce as well, most people become disabled in the workplace. They're not already disabled beforehand. It tends to hit as we get older. Of course, there are unusual situations like Lily's son and other disabled students and graduates that we work with who are perhaps younger but with a disability. So it is changing, but I still think there's a long way to go, which is indeed why organisations like EmployAbility still exist and need to exist, to enable that change to happen and to move that along with the journey.
And what are the main steps you'd like to see either the government take or employers take?
I think from the point of view briefly on government, I think schemes like Access to Work need to be much better publicised. We've just heard most people don't know about those, most small firms don't know about those. I think sort of more programmes that perhaps enable more severely disabled people to get into employment and support around that, organisations around that needs to happen. Obviously with the work that we do, we're working with people who are already at university. So it is perhaps people with disabilities that aren't as severe. However, that's not to be misconstrued to say that there aren't barriers for those people as well in the workplace. 70% of disabilities are hidden. Most people, when they think of disability, tend to think of a physical disability, perhaps somebody in a wheelchair, perhaps somebody with a missing limb, but actually 70% of disabilities are hidden. And a big issue around disability is how do you identify people, for example, an issue we have is at university who have a disability. It may be dyslexia, it may be somebody on the autistic spectrum, it may be somebody with a learning disability, it may be a mental health disability, it may be a long-term health condition. To identify those people, to be able to actually then support them in the barriers they might face. I think from the perspective of employers, I think there's a lot of education that still needs to take place. So employers understand the different barriers faced by people with different types of disabilities. And I think sometimes employers want to use a sort of one-size-fits-all approach. So, you know, if they saw somebody last week who had a visual impairment, perhaps the adjustments for that person will work for the person they're seeing this week, but it doesn't really work like that with disability.
Yes.
So I think it's a case of educating employers to think about what adjustments they can make for people coming through their recruitment processes. Where do they advertise positions that disabled people will actually see them and make the application? How do they change their own profile to be a more disability inclusive organisation, for example, rather than just saying that they are? That's what they're actually doing. What schemes have they got in place? What organisations do they work with to show willing and support? Do they run any particular programmes or schemes where they actively encourage disabled people to apply, for example?
Have you come across many companies who do actively look for disabled people?
Well, we work with many of them.
Well, that's good to hear.
We work with, so the other part of our role is actually working with organisations who want to become more disability inclusive. And so, we work with many of the big names, some of the big banks, big law firms, big tech companies, big sort of national organisations, to help them to become more disability inclusive. Now, what we're doing is not necessarily setting up special schemes for people with disabled students and graduates, but actually trying to incorporate disabled students and graduates into existing internship or graduate programs that these employers run. But we're trying to find ways in which we can do that so that people aren't being selected out because of disability, because of difference in profile, because somebody took longer to complete a degree or perhaps didn't get the grades they were expecting to achieve, even though they have the ability to do that because of disability.
Do you think that people's attitudes did change towards people, certainly with a physical disability, after the 2012 Paralympics?
Yes, I think the 2012 Paralympics certainly helped to raise an incredible amount of awareness around disability, particularly, as you said, physical disability.
And then, of course, we've recently had the Invictus Games as well, which just shows what can be achieved.
Yes, so I think all of those things go a very long way towards bringing disability to the forefront, making people think about disability. I think the one proviso I would say is there's a slight, danger of creating sort of superhuman type personalities out of that. But of course, there are very many, quote unquote, normal disabled people, just like anybody else out there, who are trying to earn a living, get into employment, get up every morning, do all the normal things that we all expect to do in our normal course of life. Yeah. I think it's important that we don't confuse those two. Disabled person doesn't have to be superhuman to succeed. They shouldn't have to be.
Yes,
and also, as you said, there's a lot of hidden disability, and that's one of the only things that I still think we don't deal with. Those kind of issues that people can't see. There's the very visible ones that we could see during the Paralympics or the Invictus Games, those kind of things where, but actually there's a lot of complicated things that people just don't know how to deal with because they're not facing them. I'm really interested. I'm very interested from an employer's point of view of knowing if there's companies out there who do mentor, because I would really love to hear from another company. I run a company. I'd very love to hear from another company who's really actively leading in best practice in this area. If there's something I can learn from them, I'd really take that on board.
Well, you should definitely get in touch with us after the programme, and I can tell you about some of those.
I will do.
But you're absolutely right. It's a very good point, Tim. That there are very, very many hidden non-visible disabilities, 70% of those. And in fact, when we work with university students, the biggest disclosed disability at university level of any disability is actually dyslexia. 40% of all disclosed disability at university level is dyslexia. Now, sometimes I get people saying, well, that's not really a disability, is it? But actually, the impact of it can be profound in the workplace, and there's different levels of dyslexia. So the impact of something like dyslexia or another learning disability like dyspraxia or many others can be that people might have very good coping strategies. They might have got to university level, but in fact, the adjustments they might need in the workplace may be quite different. It's very important to understand what those are to enable those people to be successful at getting employment, but also staying in employment and succeeding through employment. And you're right that sometimes I think the hidden disabilities actually cause employers perhaps, and the disabled people themselves, perhaps different types of issues, but as important issues as if you have a physical disability, because somebody looks as if they're just like everybody else. They don't look to have a disability, and yet because of their disability, they may need certain support or they may behave slightly differently. So if somebody's on the autistic spectrum, for example, their behavior may be impacted, their social interaction skills may be impacted by their disability, but actually to the outside world, they don't seem to have a disability. And that in itself can cause a lot of problems in the workplace in terms of how somebody is perceived. But actually, they just need support around that and understanding around that to enable them to address some of those barriers and issues and to be able to work effectively.
And if somebody has a disability, that isn't immediately seen, do they have a duty to declare that to an employer?
There is no duty to declare disability to an employer. Unless, of course, you're doing a role where there's some physical danger or physical issues around that might lead to health and safety, for example. But generally speaking, though, there is no legal requirement to disclose disability, and disclosure is a huge issue for people with disability and indeed for employers, because people are very nervous about disclosing their disability to employers. They're worried they might get discriminated against. Yeah. They don't want to be seen to be different. Particularly when we look at disabilities like mental health, for example, people are very reluctant to disclose disabilities like that. And again, if you have a hidden disability, unlike a physical, visible one, then of course you have a choice whether to disclose or not. So there are some important issues for people with disabilities who are applying for jobs to think about. At what stage do they disclose? Is it in their best interest to disclose? At what stage do they disclose? Should they disclose on the application form, on the CV? Should they disclose later down the road? At what point? And actually, it's a choice. They need to make an informed choice about that. And it's these sorts of things that we actually advise disabled students and graduates on.
Tab, thank you so